Alright, let's begin. So for this week we had to do the particle system. So as you can see here we have a spherical burst of particles, or I guess just a burst in every direction of particles. And after X amount of time the particles will expire and break. Um, so currently I just have one effect, which is this effect, so we have the way to set all the parameters on it. There's also a temporary thing, so if you define the lifespan like I did here for 5 seconds, if you were to just wait around for about 5 seconds, we will then see that the particles disappear. Um, so for effects, we just have a bunch of pass-throughs to the emitter, setting the necessary parameters for it. You can, whenever you start the play the effect temporary, that's when you use the lifespan of the emitter. Otherwise, you just emit it without a lifespan. So the emitter without lifespan goes on indefinitely, and it creates bursts based on this randomized delay that you pass through with a maximum and minimum delay. If you give it a lifespan, then it will register its alarm 0 that will inevitably call the submit exit. Alarm 1 is what's used with this burst delay, so that creates a burst and then randomizes when the next burst will happen. Creating a burst gets a established speed, angle, and scale, sets all the burst parameters, and then inserts it into a multi-map where its key value is a randomized lifespan that you defined, plus the current time in the game. So if we were to go back up to here, then we just have some setters as well for all of that randomization for the burst that I just showcased until we get to the draw phase. So for the draw phase, we loop through all the bursts until we find that we check the multi-map first for any bursts that are expired. If we find a burst that's expired, we clean up their particles and return it to the factory before removing it from the multi-map. All the bursts that are not expired will then be drawn. And then submitting exit cancels the alarm, deregisters the drawable, and then clears the bursts. Cleaning up bursts just clears all particles, returns them to the factory, and removes them from the multi-map. For bursts, they also have a factory for the particles, defining the count. We use a vector for it, and then we loop through for every single spot. We end up getting a particle from the factory. Randomize its direction based on the difference between the max and min, as well as the halfway distance, so you can get some left, some right of it. Once that's all said and done, we can rotate by the angle. Cleaning up the particles just returns them to the factory to find the parameters as well for the burst and the particles. When you draw them, we need to get the camera forward. We can use the camera forward to get the actual forward with the cross product as well as the right. With this, we can compose the rotate orient, and then compose the world matrix, set the graphic object at the world, and then render. And then we can, when the burst is destroyed, we clean up all the particles. Particles are a strut that are defined with a position, direction, and speed. Updating the particle computes the data by doing position, the direction times speed plus the position, and then you can also get the data from it as well. Lastly, both the particles and the bursts use an object pool and a factory. It's what we're used to of whenever we want a burst, we check to see if the pool is empty. If it is, we make a new one. Otherwise, we take from the top of the pool. And that is it for the particle demo. For the tank demo, I updated it to have a sound menu. So if I press the V key, we now have a soundboard. This allows us to adjust the volume. So if I were to say just put it at 86, go to the main menu, got some sounds. If I were to then lower it here, you see we're at 16. If I were to mute it as well, that just silences everything. If I were to go to 66 and unmute, we're playing at 66. If I were to mute this again, just to showcase if I start the game like this, everything is muted. But also if I press the V key, you can see that we're still at 66 volume, so it does persist. So within this the game, we now have a settings manager. This has a way to set the volume and also define for the settings what its value should be. So the setting manager is a singleton. This allows it to persist across scenes so that we can save the data and pass it through to the next settings. So whenever a setting is created, it gets the data from the settings manager and then it creates its canvas. Whenever a setting is destroyed, it then sends its data to the canvas. Just to quickly pop over here, so we have the attach and detach where we get the data and that allows us to set it. Um, so once we have all that set up, like I mentioned, on the V key, we can register and deregister the canvas. Canvas is composed of an audio slider and a mute button. The mute button we have a bit of extra steps for, because check buttons keep track of whether they are pushed or not while the scene is active. So even though when the canvas is deregistered, it's not going to be calling its down state, but it keeps track of if it was down last. So when it's re-entered, it knows that it should start calling that it's down. So we have to do this extra check to see if this is the first time we're submitting entry. If it's the first time we're submitting entry and we are supposed to be muted, then we submit entry starting in the down position. Otherwise, we submit entry normally. That's just a little extra shenanigan for that. For the audio slider, whenever we get an update on the percentage for the slider, we set the volume of the canvas and the settings to be that, and then we call the sound manager to set the player volume to be at that volume. Excuse me. For the mute button, whenever the button is pushed, we set the mute to true, and then we tell the sound manager to mute itself. Whenever it's released, we set the settings to say it's not muted anymore, and we tell the sound effects manager to unmute itself. Lastly, because it's a singleton, we clean up the settings manager over here. I forgot to showcase that. And also for the sound effects player, we now have a strategy pattern set up for it. So this is set up for muting and unmuting the game, so that when you set volume, if the game's muted, the settings manager will keep track of that volume. However, it's not going to affect the sound effect player until it's unmuted. And then when it is audible, it will just update the sounds live. Lastly, to quickly look at this, don't care. So we have 2 weeks for the options menu. I've got it pretty much working at this point, so I could. At this point, I don't think I'll have time for any ITP, so I'm just skipping to the last stuff, which is general polish. I have to implement the skybox and hopefully find some sort of models for the game, because I still don't really have any. And for the particle system, I need to do more particles, because I'm still having the particles work, but I need to make it so that I can have different directions for the particles as well, since right now I only have that singular burst in every direction, which will not work for a bullet trail. And that's it.